In a shocking twist that has sent tremors through the global Catholic community, the audio message surprised worshippers who broke into applause as the message was played. A leaked audio recording of Pope Francis has gone viral, unleashing a wave of speculation, outrage, and soul-searching. The audio, now circulating across major media platforms and social networks, and the Pope has released an audio message, reveals explosive details about the inner workings of the Vatican, and what it uncovers is deeply troubling. From doctrinal rifts to hidden agendas, the content paints a portrait of a church in crisis and a pope caught between reform and resistance. As the world reacts to this unprecedented breach, one truth is becoming clear: what's been revealed is not just controversial, it's really music. Bad. The leak that shook the world had never seen anything quite like it. On a quiet Sunday evening, just as the world's attention was focused elsewhere, a recording of Pope Francis began circulating across the internet. He is now sharing an audio message with the world. What initially seemed like a harmless leak quickly turned into a global media storm. The audio, recorded in what seemed to be an informal setting, contained shocking and candid remarks from the Pope about the Vatican's internal operations, subjects that were meant to remain behind the closed doors of the Holy See. The recording began innocuously, with Pope Francis discussing his typical day at the Vatican with a small group of trusted officials. However, it wasn't long before the conversation veered into much darker waters. At first, those who listened closely thought it was just another unverified rumor or a cleverly edited fake. But soon, the authenticity of the audio was confirmed by Vatican sources who reluctantly admitted that the voice was indeed that of the Pope. What was perhaps most shocking was the timing. Just weeks before, the Vatican had celebrated a major milestone in Pope Francis's papacy, with widespread praise for his efforts toward financial transparency and church reforms. Yet this audio painted an entirely different picture. In it, the Pope was heard speaking with a level of frustration and candor rarely seen from such a high-ranking figure. The content of the leak was damning. Not only did it reveal a Pope who appeared deeply disillusioned with the challenges facing the Vatican, but it also implicated key Vatican officials in a series of questionable activities. By the time the audio spread across news outlets, social media platforms were ablaze with debate and speculation. A glimpse into the Vatican's financial scandals, perhaps the most explosive part of the leaked audio, was Pope Francis's candid discussion of the Vatican's long-standing financial issues. For years, the Vatican's finances have been shrouded in secrecy, with periodic reports surfacing about mismanagement, corrupt dealings, and high-stakes investments gone awry. But nothing had prepared the world for the level of insight the Pope offered in this leaked recording. His frustration was palpable as he described in disarming detail the catastrophic losses sustained by the Vatican through a series of high-risk investments. There was a report that Pope Francis not only knew about the failed London property deal in the Vatican, but he also authorized it. Among the most significant was the London property deal that had been a source of scandal for years. Pope Francis referred to the deal as a disaster, lamenting how a lucrative property venture had turned into a multi-million-dollar loss, threatening the Vatican's already precarious financial stability. The deal in question had involved the Vatican Secretariat of State purchasing a building in London for a staggering £300 million, intending to secure a profitable return through the sale of the property. However, the investment quickly spiraled out of control, and the Vatican was forced to sell the property at a massive loss, sparking a series of investigations into financial mismanagement and corruption within the Church. The scandal had prompted the Vatican to set up a commission to reform its finances, but as Pope Francis admitted in the recording, the damage had already been done. His frustration with the situation was undeniable. "We trusted the wrong people," he reportedly said, his voice tinged with anger and disbelief. "Too many false promises. Too many lies." It was clear that the Pope felt personally responsible for allowing such a high-profile failure to occur under his watch. And the leak provided a rare glimpse of the internal pressures he was facing. For years, Pope Francis had made it his mission to bring transparency and accountability to the Vatican's financial operations. But the leaked conversation suggested that even his most ambitious reforms were stymied by entrenched interests and a lack of cooperation from key figures within the Vatican's hierarchy. Pope Francis has long said that he wants the Church to be more transparent. To that end, the Vatican recently released two important financial statements. The Pope's words also painted a disturbing picture of the level of corruption that had taken root in the Vatican's financial structures. "There are wolves in the flock," the Pope was overheard saying, referring to high-ranking officials who had been involved in or turned a blind eye to financial misconduct. He hinted that certain members of the Vatican's financial offices were more interested in preserving their own power and wealth than in serving the interests of the Church. What made the leak even more explosive was the fact that Pope Francis had been vocal in his condemnation of financial corruption within the Church. His papacy was defined by efforts to clean up the Vatican's finances, eliminate the Vatican Bank's shadowy dealings, and push for ethical investments. The leak, however, suggested that these efforts had failed to address the root causes of the corruption. Far from a smooth reform process, it appeared that Pope Francis had been battling against a tide of entrenched interests who resisted his every attempt to bring the Vatican's finances into the 21st century. Beyond the scandalous financial losses, the Pope's remarks indicated that there were deeper, more troubling questions about the Vatican's finances. Was the financial system in place truly transparent, or was it riddled with backroom deals and questionable practices? And if Pope Francis's push for reform had been so opposed within the Vatican, how much of the financial system was beyond his control? In the wake of the leak, analysts and critics alike began to speculate, was this the first crack in the papacy of Pope Francis? Could these financial scandals, once hidden from the public eye, spiral into a scandal so large that it threatened the very foundation of the Vatican's authority? What did it mean for the future of the Church when the Pope himself expressed such frustration over the ongoing struggles with financial reform? Doctrinal reforms that divide the Church. The leaked audio not only exposed Pope Francis's deep frustration with the inner workings of the Vatican but also highlighted a central theme that had increasingly become the focal point of his papacy: doctrinal reforms that had left the Church divided. For years, Pope Francis had been an advocate for reforming the Church's teachings to adapt to the modern world. Pope Francis, he made toward making LGBTQ people feel more welcomed by the Catholic Church. However, his attempts to address controversial issues like divorce, LGBTQ+ rights, and interfaith dialogue had sparked intense backlash from conservative factions within the Church. The scandalous content of the leaked recording revealed just how far the rift had grown and how these doctrinal battles had become a central part of the power struggles now at play within the Vatican. In the recording, Pope Francis could be heard expressing his disillusionment with the opposition he faced, particularly from the more traditional elements within the Church. His voice trembled with emotion as he described the resistance he encountered when trying to push for a more inclusive, compassionate approach to Catholic doctrine. His remarks revealed a personal struggle between his vision for a more open, accepting Church and the deeply entrenched forces determined to maintain the status quo. "You cannot lead the Church with half measures," Pope Francis was heard saying in the recording, his tone almost bitter. "Either you change it, or it will change you. And we are not here to preserve an institution, we are here to serve the people." These words revealed not just a critique of the Church's bureaucracy but a direct challenge to the ideological pillars that many within the Vatican had spent their careers building. The Pope's message was clear: the Church had to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. At the heart of this ideological war were Pope Francis's attempts to address long-standing doctrines that had been seen as unalterable by the conservative wing of the Church. His stance on divorce, for example, had been a major point of contention. Pope Francis's reflection on the family and family life will be released April 8. The document The Joy of Love, on Love in the Family will be released at a Vatican News conference. In 2016, the Pope issued Amoris Laetitia, an apostolic exhortation that sought to extend mercy to divorced and remarried Catholics, allowing them to receive communion under certain circumstances. This was a radical departure from the Church's traditional teaching, which had prohibited divorced Catholics from receiving the sacrament unless they had annulled their previous marriages. The move was seen as a sign of the Pope's push for a more inclusive Church, but it sparked immediate outrage among traditionalists who saw it as a direct violation of sacred doctrine. The leaked audio further illuminated the severity of the opposition that Pope Francis had faced. As the Pope spoke of the resistance, he pointed specifically to powerful cardinals who had publicly opposed his initiatives. Cardinal Raymond Burke, a prominent conservative cleric, was one of the most vocal critics of Amoris Laetitia. Burke had called for the Pope to clarify the document's ambiguities, even suggesting that it might be heretical. The recording hinted at an ongoing feud between the Pope and Burke, with the Pope describing certain figures within the Church as prelates who have lost their way and spiritual gatekeepers who have no place in a modern, merciful Church. The controversy surrounding LGBTQ+ issues was another area of deep division that the leaked audio touched upon. Pope Francis had been an outspoken advocate for LGBTQ+ rights, famously stating, "If someone is gay and seeks the Lord with a good will, who am I to judge?" This was a stark contrast to the more conservative voices within the Church who maintained that homosexuality was intrinsically disordered. The Pope's approach, which emphasized compassion and inclusion, was seen by many as an attempt to humanize a long-rejected group, but for others, it was seen as a betrayal of traditional Catholic teaching. In the audio, Pope Francis lamented the rigidity of the doctrinal opposition he faced, remarking that the Church had allowed itself to be enslaved by rules that are no longer relevant to the lives of its people. He spoke of his frustration in dealing with Church leaders who clung to outdated ideas, using the Church's teachings as weapons rather than instruments of peace and compassion. "The Church is not a museum," he said. "It is a living institution, and it must breathe, it must evolve." The tension within the Vatican was not just ideological. It was deeply personal. Pope Francis's relationship with his closest advisors had been strained by these doctrinal battles. In the leaked recording, there was a moment of apparent resignation in his voice as he discussed the infighting that had erupted among his inner circle over doctrinal differences. "I sometimes feel that I'm a man alone," he confided. "The Church is meant to be a communion of love, but we have become a battlefield of ideologies." The recording exposed just how deeply the Pope's desire for reform had conflicted with the deeply held beliefs of those within the Church who viewed his changes as dangerous and heretical. As Pope Francis pressed for greater openness, traditionalists dug in their heels, determined to preserve the orthodoxy that had been passed down through centuries. The leaks ignited a firestorm within the Church, with many calling for a new Catholic rebellion against the Pope's reforms. The factions were clearly drawn, one side advocating for progress and inclusivity, the other holding fast to doctrinal purity and tradition. This ideological divide had also played out in the public sphere, as conservative Catholic media outlets launched harsh critiques of Pope Francis's papacy, accusing him of watering down the Church's teachings in an attempt to appease modern secularism. They pointed to his positions on divorce, LGBTQ+ rights, and interfaith relations as proof that Pope Francis was steering the Church toward dangerous waters where the very essence of Catholic doctrine was at risk of being lost. But while the conservative camp rallied against the Pope, his supporters argued that he was fulfilling the Church's duty to evolve with the times. Progressive Catholics hailed his calls for a more compassionate and inclusive Church, one that recognized the dignity of all people, regardless of their background or personal circumstances. The Pope's supporters saw the doctrinal reforms as a necessary response to a changing world, one where issues like divorce and LGBTQ+ rights were no longer fringe concerns but central to the lives of millions of Catholics worldwide. In the leaked recording, Pope Francis expressed his belief that the Church's failure to address these issues head-on was part of what had contributed to its decline in relevance. "We have become irrelevant," he said. "We have failed to speak to the hearts of the faithful. We have to be the voice of the marginalized, the voice of the excluded. The Church cannot be a fortress, it must be a field hospital for the wounded." The leak had unearthed the raw emotions beneath the Vatican's polished exterior, showing a Pope who had become weary of fighting entrenched forces within the Church. As the world reacted to the revelation of these deep divides, the question remained, would Pope Francis be able to secure his vision for a reformed, modern Church? Or would the internal opposition prove insurmountable, causing irreparable damage to his papacy and the Church itself? The battle for the future of Catholic doctrine was far from over, and the leaked audio had only intensified the pressure on Pope Francis to navigate these turbulent waters with care and determination. The Vatican's culture of secrecy unveiled. As the leaked audio continued to circulate, one of the most striking revelations was Pope Francis's candid commentary on the Vatican's culture of secrecy. For centuries, the Vatican has been notorious for its closed-door nature, where information, especially regarding its internal affairs, is guarded with the utmost care. The leak, however, gave the world an unprecedented peek behind the papal curtain, and the image it painted was far from reassuring. In the recording, Pope Francis described how this culture of secrecy had permeated nearly every aspect of Vatican life, including its decision-making processes. He mentioned the reluctance of certain church leaders to share information or make decisions transparently, hinting at an internal system that favored silence over accountability. "There are those who are more interested in keeping their own power intact than in the truth," the Pope's voice echoed, filled with disappointment. "The walls here are high, and they are meant to keep things in, not out." For Pope Francis, the culture of secrecy had long been a point of frustration. From the very beginning of his papacy, he had made it clear that he wanted to foster a church that was open, transparent, and accountable, an institution that was responsive to its people. Yet in this private conversation, he expressed how deeply ingrained this secrecy had become within the Vatican's inner workings. Whether it was the protection of powerful cardinals, the prevention of scandals, or the safeguarding of personal agendas, it was clear that transparency had long been seen as a threat. The Pope's tone suggested a profound internal struggle. Despite his reforms and attempts at improving the Vatican's transparency, his efforts had often been thwarted by resistance from within the very system he was trying to change. His reflections hinted at a relentless battle with senior church officials who, despite public declarations of reform, continued to operate under a veil of secrecy. Some had even gone so far as to argue that the public should not be privy to the inner workings of the Vatican, believing that such openness could damage the Church's reputation and its authority. This tension between reform and tradition was starkly revealed in the audio. In one particular moment, Pope Francis openly criticized those in the Curia, the administrative body of the Vatican, who would rather maintain the status quo than allow for any real change. Pope Francis has sharply criticized bureaucracy in the Vatican, saying gossip, pettiness, rivalry, and hunger for power. "Some believe that if we reveal too much, we weaken the faith. But I say that only by being honest and transparent can we strengthen it," he was heard saying, his voice unwavering but tinged with exhaustion. For years, the Vatican had prioritized the preservation of its image over the needs of its followers, and many wondered if Pope Francis had finally reached a breaking point. The leak underscored that while Pope Francis had made great strides in combating corruption, his greatest obstacle might have been the very people he relied on within the Vatican. These were individuals who held tightly to the old ways, valuing the internal power structures more than any external moral imperative. By admitting to this in such a public way, Pope Francis unwittingly exposed the Church's greatest vulnerability, a culture that, despite all its outward signs of reform, remained entrenched in secrecy and self-preservation. The Vatican's response: spin, silence, and speculation. The release of the leaked audio left the Vatican in turmoil, and the initial public response was one of stunned silence. Vatican officials refused to comment on the content of the leaked recording. This silence only served to fuel further speculation, with analysts and the media eagerly dissecting every word from the Pope's conversation. It became clear that the Vatican's strategy was to adopt a posture of deflection. The official line was that the leak was an unfortunate violation of privacy, and the Church was working internally to address the situation. However, this response was met with growing skepticism, as many critics began to question how such sensitive audio could have been leaked in the first place. Was it really a random act of betrayal, or was this the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine the Pope? For many Catholics, Francis's words rang with an uncomfortable truth. The Vatican, long seen as a symbol of spiritual purity, was now portrayed as an institution rife with intrigue, secrecy, and political maneuvering. Some saw the Pope's candidness as a sign of courage, a leader willing to speak the uncomfortable truths that others were too afraid to confront. "It's shocking," they said, "but so brave." Others, however, feared that the revelations would irreparably damage the Church's reputation, both within the faith and among the broader public. As the media frenzy grew, the Vatican found itself unable to contain the narrative. The leak had struck at the very heart of the institution, and the damage was done. Commentators noted how the Vatican's response, or lack thereof, only deepened the sense of mistrust among the faithful. If Pope Francis had indeed been speaking so openly about the dysfunctions of the Church, why was the Vatican so reluctant to engage with the issue directly? Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Vatican's internal response was far from unified. Some of the Pope's allies in the Curia were reportedly working behind closed doors to identify the source of the leak and prevent further exposure. These figures were keen to protect the integrity of the Pope's legacy and preserve any hope of moving forward with his reform agenda. But others within the Vatican, possibly those sympathetic to the factions described in the leak, appeared more interested in protecting their own positions and staving off any real change. The lack of a coordinated, decisive response from the Vatican left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by outside forces. The media began to speculate about the long-term consequences for Pope Francis's papacy. Would the Pope remain in power long enough to enact the sweeping reforms he had promised, or would the internal resistance and external pressures eventually force him into retreat? When Francis passed away on April 21, 2025, the question answered itself. The Pope had not had, and would not have, any more time to make more meaningful changes within the Church. This leaked audio would be the last time he raised his voice on the problems plaguing the Church. But while the world waited for the new Pope's opinion on the matters, the speculative nature of those questions only intensified, as the media storm continued, turning the leak from a private moment of frustration into a global crisis of confidence in the Vatican's leadership. As the scandal continued to unfold, the world waited to see how Pope Leo XIV and the Vatican as a whole would respond to the growing wave of scrutiny. Would this be the beginning of a new chapter of accountability for the Church, or the end of an era marked by secrecy and inaction? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the Vatican would never be the same again. Thanks for watching.